America First was Donald Trump's 2016 campaign slogan. We will look after ourselves, not other countries. How have the last 4 years changed America's approach to foreign affairs and indeed changed the world at large? This is Roundtable. Hello and a warm welcome from me, David Foster. In this, the latest in our series looking back at President's time so far in the Oval Office, we examine an era of Twitter diplomacy and big changes.
The office of President of the United States.
And what had been a slogan became reality after the 2016 election, and since then there have been some of the biggest changes ever to US foreign policy. From his attempts to build a Mexico border wall to withdrawing from international agreements like the Iran nuclear deal. America's 45th president has made a significant impact on world order. His election opponent, Joe Biden, has accused Trump of abandoning moral leadership and has promised a global summit of democracy if he is elected. So what kind of impact has Donald Trump's America First policy had on the US's standing in the world? And will it help him in the White House? Very pleased to say that we can welcome to this roundtable out of North Carolina in the United States, Klaus Larres, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We go to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Say hello to Scottie, Nell, Hughes, political commentator, and then to the UK. And we welcome Gina, Yannitell, Reinhardt, Associate Professor at the University of Essex. Great to have all three of you on. It's amazing how quickly 4 years can go in some cases, but in this case it seemed like it's a large part of North American history of the last 50 or 60 years. Let's ask one question first that each one of you I'd like to address, and that is, starting with you, Klaus, last 4 years, America strong or selfish in the eyes of the world?
I think the eyes of the world were very disappointed in the Trump administration. His slogan was, of course, America First, and he did actually realize that. He totally focused on the United States, on domestic affairs, and neglected largely foreign policy affairs. He neglected alliances, particularly with the allies in Europe and within NATO, and he neglected the Asian allies, and he really focused on a select number of countries in the world. Of course, he also had a number of foreign policy successes, but on the whole, I think the world lacked American leadership. They missed that the United States were not there in many crises, and felt that there was a vacuum, and that vacuum was rapidly being filled by both China and Russia. So I think on the whole, the world is ready to see the departure of the Trump administration and hopefully get a more constructive, more multilateral new administration in January 2021.
Well, we shall see. Scottie, let me come to you first of all. Klaus mentions their neglect. That is debatable. We'll go into that in some detail in just a moment when we look at particular aspects of Donald Trump's record. But strong or selfish?
I think it's strong. Now, it's not exactly what President Trump promised in 2016, as he definitely had made commitments to his voters, to his supporters, that he was going to draw back the interventionist and bring back American focus on domestic issues. He's tried to do that. But in regards to the rest of the world, it is better when people within their own region actually control the region and take and dominate the region, the political, what's going on politically within that area. When the United States gets involved in areas they shouldn't be, nothing good ever long-term comes out of it. And so neglecting our allies, maybe we're not financing everything anymore, and maybe President Trump is asking for more of those countries to take responsibility. But that does not mean that the world dislikes President Trump. I think he actually has a good relationship with many of the leaders around the world because they respect him. And just like I would want President Trump to put America first, I would expect that same of any leader of any country to put their country first instead of, and as long as it did not hurt other countries. And putting America first does not hurt any other country.
Gina, is it not as simple as strong or selfish, perhaps?
It isn't. In fact, the U.S. has been both strong and selfish, and actually strong in its selfishness. So what Donald Trump has done is take an isolationist stance. And that is exactly what he promised he would do. And he's accomplished quite a bit of that. He's pulled out of several international agreements and treaties, and he has alienated several traditional allies. His popularity around the world is not high. He is not beloved. But he did deliver on several of his promises to step out of a lot of international situations and to focus on domestic politics. And he's presented a very strong view, a very strong position of the U.S. in this regard, not just in where the U.S. stands in other international contexts, but in where the U.S. stands with respect to international visitors and immigrants into the country itself.
Can we take a look at some of those agreements, treaties that President Trump decided were no longer suitable for America? Paris Climate Agreement pulled out of in 2017, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was 2017 trade deal with the Far East, Iran nuclear deal 2018, UN Human Rights Council 2018, and formally moved to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization in July of this year. Scottie, which of those would you say was most beneficial, if it was, to the United States?
I think any alliances that we had with the Asian region, and whether you're talking about and I think the biggest part of that is because it was actually hurting American workers, American farmers. It was hurting our manufacturing here, as we were incentivizing American companies to go over into Asia and to have their manufacturing there. And they do have abysmal human rights policies over there. Yet the workers were making clothes cheaper than what we could do here in the United States because we have higher standards for our workers here. And so, yes, that adjustment needed to happen. And so I think that one right there has probably been the best one. And once again, it's a revolving. As long as the United States economy is strong, especially considering the rest of the world, according to my two colleagues, it look like they need the United States to finance a lot of these trade deals. I think that as long as the U.S. economy is strong and stronger, then we have that ability to do so. But unfortunately, over the last 10, 20 years of economic policy, we have seen our money, we have seen our jobs go across these. And unfortunately, we're allowing abysmal labor markets, abysmal labor standards in a lot of these Asian countries, all for the sacrifice of a cheaper good. That's not good for the world. It's not good for the United States.
Okay, Klaus, so Scottie picks the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm going to ask you about the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which President Trump said of the deal, which President Obama agreed was absolutely terrible. It was right to get out of it. What do you think about the decision he made to dump it?
Well, I think it was totally wrong. It has not helped things at all. He left the Iranian nuclear deal. He imposed new sanctions on Iran, but the region has not become safer or more stable because of it. Iran has not been contained. It is actually more dangerous. It is much closer to developing a nuclear bomb than it was when the nuclear deal was still in force. So the deal was, of course, not ideal. And it focused on the nuclear issue. It did not focus on Iran's behavior in the region, which is, and I'm sure we can all agree on that, which is not good, which is at times quite appalling. Also, the human rights situation within Iran, the government as such, are all very deplorable. But that was not what the deal was all about. The deal was to contain Iran's development of nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons. And I think that was what was good about the deal. And all the other issues.
Can I ask you this?
Were not addressed.
With regard to Iran, do you think countries such as Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, we now know Sudan, possibility of Saudi Arabia, Mauritania possibly, Oman, would have agreed to normalize relations with Israel if the United States hadn't played such a strong hand against Iran?
Well, the question is, what is more advantageous? Probably not. I think it helped the good relations with Trump developed, for example, with Saudi Arabia, helped to normalize relations between Israel and a number of Gulf states. And even the Saudis are kind of close about rethinking their relationship with Israel. But that still leaves the Iranians in a very difficult position, in a rogue situation. They are still another very unstable factor in the Middle East. And I think they would have contained that role of being such an unstable role, of having such a rogue status, that would have been contained if the nuclear deal had been kept intact. And I believe the deal wasn't perfect, but why not work from within the deal to improve it rather than leave the deal and try to influence it from outside? Trump has always maintained that he wanted to negotiate a new deal. Yeah, but I think we see no sign of that he is actually about to negotiate a new deal with Iran. No effort by the administration has been made.
Okay, Gina, let me ask you about this one, and I'm going to quote what President Trump said. I think it was in 2016, before as the campaign was starting to gather momentum in that year. He said about NATO, the countries we defend must pay for the cost of this defense. If not, the US must be prepared to let these countries defend themselves. We have no choice. Was it fair of him to say that he felt America was being taken advantage of?
Well, it's certainly fair for him to feel that way. I think a lot of other people agreed with that. For many, many years, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has been anchored by the presence of the United States, both financially and militarily. Klaus raises an interesting point, though, in pulling out of NATO and pulling out of the UNHCR and pulling out of the World Health Organization. What is the purpose that is served? Now, contrary to what Scottie suggested, I did not say that the U.S. should be financing all of these things. What I said was that pulling out is isolationist, and it is. Now, if you think that isolationism is best for the U.S., then obviously you agree with these decisions. But in terms of keeping a very strong stance, being the power leader and being a hegemon in the world, you can't pull out of all of the agreements that you so carefully helped to broker, even if it was several years ago. By being on the outside, the U.S. doesn't appear strong. The U.S. appears petulant. And if
I just want to say,
well, wait a minute.
I just want to say that when you just one second before we move on. I think you meant to say pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal as opposed to pulling out of NATO. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm pretty sure that's what you meant.
Oh, yes, I apologize. Yes, thank you. Pulling out of, I did mean that, the Iran nuclear deal, but also the UNHCR. And the thing is that if you want to lead in those issues, if you want people to take your stance as their own and be allies in those terms, then you should be doing something to fix the situation. And simply leaving the agreements that are already there without backing that up with other activities does make the U.S. look quite petulant and not cooperative and not like a leader.
Let me bring Scottie back in at this point on NATO by basically saying, if you don't pay up, we're not going to look after you. You can look after yourselves. Did he not, to some extent, weaken NATO in the eyes of, let's say, Russia, which hasn't really been contained by the United States and Western forces when it comes to incursions into neighboring countries?
Well, I think what we need to look at here, and it's with all those agreements, but especially even also NATO, is accountability. There is a lacking of accountability. If you keep throwing money at an issue, which is Washington, D.C.'s normal standard, that doesn't mean the issue is going to improve. And that has to deal with all of those deals, but especially in regards to NATO, when the United States was personally financing, well, I think it's more than 50% of the budget, was putting it in. These other countries had promised they knew what they were supposed to owe, and yet they were not putting it in. We have to also look at
but does that not make it look? Does it not make it look to countries such as Russia that NATO is fractured and thereby weaker than it was before?
But it is fractured, I think, and that's the conversation that President Trump wants, and I think we need to have. We have to remember why NATO was originally established. Times have changed since that post-Cold War, post-Soviet era, and things, therefore, NATO needs to change as well. Are our allies of the United States still our allies? Our enemies have changed. Our friendships have changed. So NATO itself does need to be adjusted. It does need to be worked. But most importantly, everybody who wants to be a part of it needs to contribute their fair share, and it should not be on the burden of the American taxpayers.
There are
But
two
isn't it
areas
the
that I want
case
to cover.
it's
Sorry, Klaus,
strange?
you come in, then I'll explain where we're going after that.
I mean, what you said is quite right, that the European allies don't spend enough on defense. But this is not a new
Although
issue.
that has been increased, I must say that has been increased since
Yes,
what President
but
Trump said.
they still, most of them, one has to admit that, most of them don't reach the 2% of GNP they indicated they wanted to achieve. For often very good domestic reasons, but still the fact is they didn't. And that is an old problem. That has nothing to do with Trump. Obama criticized that already. And before Obama, presidents always criticized
But they wouldn't have put in the extra money that they are now putting in, surely, if President Trump hadn't said what he said.
No, but the way he is saying what he says, this is the issue. You do not go to a NATO summit and shout at your allies. You may even shout at them behind closed doors in private conversation. You do not humiliate them in public. You do not refuse to sign communiques or very, tough communiques, which is clear. Everyone knows that was a big shouting match. And when you show up for the picture, everyone is clear. You are the outsider. You are the one who really no one wants to mix with because you're so unpleasant personally and regarding your government. This is no way.
But if it works, and I would like to move on a little bit now, because there are two areas I want to cover. And one is the approach to China, and the other is what might be different if Joe Biden comes into office. So, Gina, let me ask you first of all. I mean, he talks the talk when it comes to getting tough on China. Has President Trump been tough on that country?
Not really. It should be known and clear that very few presidents have done anything that's been tough for China. China is raft with human rights abuses. China does not play by the rules of the international agreements, and we have allowed that to persist for decades. The tax that Trump instituted on Chinese raw materials is actually paid by the small producers and small businesses that are importing Chinese goods. It's not being paid by China, and it's not being paid by Chinese manufacturers either. And I think that if we look at the numbers, it's pretty clear that Chinese manufacturing has not taken a large hit by this tax. It's called the Trump tax when you import goods, and it's very clear on your bill of lading that it's assessed by customs as the Trump duty. So that is not damaging China, and very few of the other policies are. There have been statements that have been relatively rude, but particularly in terms of being so friendly with North Korea and distancing some of the other allies in the region that have typically been on the side of the U.S. I think that China is not afraid of the U.S. and not really concerned with the actions that Trump takes in its regard.
Okay, Gina, thank you for now. We'll go around the table on this one, if we may. Klaus, would Joe Biden be any different, or highlight the differences there might be?
He would also try to be tough on China. I do think that Trump has been relatively tough, not always in a successful way, but he tried to have a tougher approach towards China. There's a consensus in DC that both Democrats and Republicans will pursue a very similar policy. The difference would be regarding Biden that his approach to the problem would be much different to Trump. It would be less vulgar, less direct, and more the attempt to enter into a dialogue with China. Above all, you could rely on Biden having the same policy yesterday and next week and next month, rather than changing it on a daily basis, depending on the last person who entered the Oval Office and talked to you, which was often Trump's approach, who tended to be highly unpredictable in his policy. Sometimes he had, particularly at the beginning, he was very cozy with Xi Jinping and tried to use him for solving the North Korean problem. When that didn't work to his liking, then he started the trade war and started shouting at him. And there's always that personal element in Trump's relationship and in Trump's diplomacy. And I think we wouldn't see that in a Biden administration. It would be
Scottie,
more consistent, more predictable.
Are we going to see a tougher America in some ways, but a more diplomatic America if it is Joe Biden in the White House, like an iron fist in a velvet glove?
Well, words are one thing, and those do matter. I agree about the diplomatic. You might have a more diplomatic on the front, but make no mistake, a Joe Biden administration is going to be just like a Barack Obama. It's just going to be part two of that. It's going to have the same policies, the same tone that got us into this situation as it is. I agree with my colleague. China doesn't respect anybody, but they did come to the table, and they came to the United States in a large trade deficit that we were having with them. The Chinese do need the U.S. eventually, and the Trump trade tax, the whole goal of it was maybe in the short term, you're right, maybe it was punishing, but it was in the long term to motivate those businesses to return, as they have started to do, back to the United States to make their products, to use the products that we create here, use the parts that we create here in the United States. That is where it ultimately will hurt China in the long term. And so I think that was the reason why President Trump has had to be the way he is, because China doesn't respect us. They don't respect any country in the world right now. And so you do have to take a hard stance. You have to take an unpredictable stance when dealing with leadership like that.
Do you think, Scottie, and then I'll ask the other two of this question as well, do you think America First is a vote winner in the United States for Donald Trump?
It won him in 2016, and considering the fallout from the coronavirus that came from another country across the way, absolutely. The question is now President Trump is going to have to be held to a record, something he did not have in 2016. There was the hope he would be as strong on it, but now he has to answer for some of the areas that he was more weak when he didn't put America first. So yes, I still think it is a winning catchphrase. Obviously, it's the reason why the campaign's using it so much. But once again, a stronger America is better for the world, especially in times of need.
Gina, let me put that one to you slightly differently. Does it matter at all to most American citizens what it does when dealing with other countries in the world?
Most American citizens do not find their daily lives affected by the behavior of the U.S. in the rest of the world. If that's your question, then the answer is no. However, the slogan America First is very compelling to a group of Americans who find themselves in the past 10 years or so in a position that they don't want to be in personally and individually. And when people see themselves being passed by others economically, they don't like that. And the idea of putting America first is something that people can rally behind. So in that sense, it is definitely getting votes. And it is one of the only ways that Trump is going to votes is by convincing people that that's what he's doing. The issue becomes then who believes him and who believes that what he's doing is putting America first.
Okay, Klaus, we're coming towards the end of the program. I'm sorry to say, but Klaus, is it as Gina perhaps describes a case of looking like you are the strong man in the world and we'll sort ourselves out at home because of what I'm doing with the rest of them, whereas in fact the ordinary American, if there is such a person, simply says, look, as long as I'm okay, I don't care what the rest of the world does or thinks?
There's an element of that in every country, I think. But in 2016, many Americans, and it of course was a very narrow victory, he didn't win the popular vote. In 2016, many Americans gave Trump the benefit of the doubt. And first, America First contributed to that, certainly. Now, I think many people have been very disappointed. When you look at the country, it's in a terrible mess. It's, of course, the COVID crisis hasn't been put under control, unlike in China, unlike in many other countries. The economy is in a mess. It's gradually recovering. But when you look at other countries, the economy is recovering more quickly. And over 10 million Americans are still unemployed. So a lot of people are disappointed. And I think America First is often viewed with an element of, yeah, it would be nice if. But everyone knows America is not first anymore. And for most Americans, the image the United States has in the world is important in a general way. And that image, I think, has gone down. They know that America is not as strong, is not as appreciated among the rest of the world as it used to be 4 years ago or 8 years ago or 20 years ago.
Going to take a lot to change that?
No, I don't think so. I think the world is desperate for American leadership. The Europeans certainly are. If there was a constructive American president in the White House, and it doesn't matter if it were a Republican or a Democrat, who was multilateral, who was a benign leader, who was not soft, but who also made demands, but who led and did not allow vacuums arise, who was a genuine Democrat, who paid attention to human rights, who paid attention to the environment in a general way and to public health, I think the Europeans would love to
I'm sorry to have to end it there, but you used the word a genuine Democrat when referring to what might be better. So I think perhaps we know exactly where you might be voting next week. I don't want to.
Democrat being a democratically convinced politician. That's what I meant.
A little D, a little D. Listen, thank you very much indeed, Klaus. Thank you, Scottie. Good to have you on the program, and Gina, much appreciated. I'm sorry we couldn't go on for a great deal longer. So America first, Donald Trump first, or Donald Trump second? We shall see. From me, David Foster from the Roundtable team, thank you for watching this program. Hope to have your company in the future. Until then, goodbye.